Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians, with a single advance in favor of the Ukrainians. There are also some updates with regards to the fighting to the north of Pokrovsk, where the Russians continue their offensive operations to outflank the Ukrainian counterattacks, aiming at cutting off the supplies to the Russian forces operating northeast of Pokrovsk. Taking a closer look, we start out to the southeast of Pokrovsk, where Russians were geolocated to be fighting in the eastern flank of Novopavlivka. This is likely through the road here to the south, moving into the settlement, as Russians have recently captured these fortified positions to the south in the previous month, while the town of Junishine, here to the southwest of Novopavlivka, remains a killing zone for both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers operating in the area. The Russians are unable to push through, with the Ukrainians consistently counterattacking, and both sides are facing off against each other in that direction, ending in a stalemate between the two sides. However, the Russians have pushed into Novopavlivka from the east. In the geolocated footage itself, the Russians were driving through a road, which is likely this road here to the south, although it isn't confirmed, which means the Russians would be pushing through this road into Novopavlivka. The alternative is through the E50 highway, which is unlikely, as just said. Junishine is a kill zone for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Russians are now fighting within Novopavlivka in the eastern flank, as we see with the geolocated footage. This is a difficult position for the Russians to hold, because the Ukrainians still have fortified positions on the eastern flank and positions along the forest line, as well as their positions within the settlement itself to fight back against these Russian forces. The Ukrainians have several supply lines going through from Mirnorod and Pokrovsk itself to pressure these Russian forces. However, they will now be spreading their forces between Novopavlivka and Junishine. This means the Russians are likely aiming for a push from Junishine or the E50 highway positions to pass through, enter the kill zone, and move on to the next position, which is Novopavlivka, potentially connecting with the forces on the eastern flank through the western flank, gain control over the fortified positions here to the west of Novopavlivka, and the railway up to the town will allow the Russians to strengthen offensive operations to gain control over this settlement as well, and double down on their fighting in the direction of the Shakhtarsky district. Connecting with the forces in that direction will allow for additional supply lines into the city itself, and to fight over the apartment complex area, which is the main fortified position of the Ukrainians within the city. The Russians already hold positions in the central and western parts of it. However, the eastern part remains completely under Ukrainian control. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, to the northeast of the city, a lot of fighting is taking place. The Ukrainians have solidified a foothold within the northern flank of Novotoretsk as they aim to gain full control over the settlement, cutting off the main artery of Russian supplies going into the western bank of the river line. The Russians have several positions to the northwest of this, cutting off Novotoretsk by getting control of it, and with the combined push in the direction of Boivka, the Ukrainians can gain full control over both settlements and cut off these Russian forces completely. The Ukrainians are also attempting to cut off their positions further north from Volodymyrivka in the western direction, flanking Pankivka from the north and Nikhonorivka from the southwest, where they're looking to connect these two flanks and gain control over the areas. The Russians in turn are countering in the direction of Nikhonorivka, where they're looking to regain control over the settlement and counterattack the Ukrainian forces in the northeast. At the same time, fighting continues over Novoshakhove, where the Russians are looking to flank the Ukrainian forces by gaining control over the northern flank and pushing down south towards Doroshne, which is the main Ukrainian outpost, to fight east of this anti-tank and Dragon Teeth line located here to the west of Nikhonorivka. This means if the Russians gain control over Novoshakhove, Ivanivka, and push towards Doroshne, these Ukrainian forces will be operationally encircled and would have to pass through several defensive lines that block the movement of their forces to resupply their forces, making it difficult to sustain their offensive operations towards Boivka. At the same time, they're also flanking the Ukrainian forces to the northeast of Nikhonorivka by pushing in the direction of Shakhove and Volodymyrivka from the western direction. The Russians are also fighting over the positions here northwest of Shahove. However, there's been no update on the area for a while. This means it is unclear whether the Russians are continuing offensive operations or if they have reached a stalemate here as well. As for the eastern flank, the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Sofievka and Shahove from the eastern flank as they continue offensive operations here. The Russians are here looking to reach Sofievka to the north and Shahove to the south through the roads connecting in the east. This is to avoid overloading the supply capabilities of the forces in the western direction by also supporting the forces in the east, and to support the pincer maneuver from the eastern flank to cut off the supplies going through Sofievka and Shahove to their forward positions fighting near Volodymyrivka and Pankivka. This will cut off the Ukrainian counterattack in the northern flank. So the Russians are working on counterattacks in every single area. The Ukrainians are launching their own counteroffensive operations to cut off the Russian supply lines. Based on this, we can see there is definitely no conclusion to this fighting yet. Anything can happen. The Ukrainians can cut off the Russian forces and the Ukrainian counterattacks can be cut off by the Russian forces. Based on that, we can see that it can turn to either direction, and both sides are dedicating a lot of their forces and supplies for this fighting here north of Pokrovsk. The outcome for the Russians would be solidifying their positions here to the north of Pokrovsk and restarting the offensive operations to gain control over Rodinsky on the northern flank, cutting off one of the main supply lines of the Ukrainian forces in the area, and also to consolidate their positions on the northern flank, potentially gaining control of additional roads to the flank of Druzhkivka along this defensive line, getting control over which will allow them to not just operationally encircle Kościanivka, but also Druzhkivka further north, cutting the Sloviansk-Kościanivka line into half. At the same time, the Ukrainians, if they succeed, will be able to stabilize the situation on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, gain control of the positions here in their push in the northeastern flank of the city, and to double down on their offensive operations to cut off the Russian positions across the river line, regaining control over the river line and the defensive lines along the river line to solidify the eastern flank of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, allowing them to redirect the remaining forces to the western flank of Pokrovsk and to the south of the city with stable supply lines here in the northern flank. This means a lot is at stake over the fighting to the northeast of Pokrovsk. It is not an exaggeration to say the outcome of the battle northeast of Pokrovsk will determine whether Pokrovsk itself holds for another half a year or just a few weeks. And even if the fighting ends in a stalemate between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, the Russians are taking advantage of it, which would allow them to continue their offensive operations within the city, while the Ukrainian forces are dedicated on the eastern flank, which could cut off some of their main supply lines leading to these operating forces. This means a stalemate or a Russian victory would be a Russian victory, while a Ukrainian victory alone would be a Ukrainian victory, and a stalemate would be a loss for the Ukrainians, as the situation is currently in favor of the Russians. In the northern flank in the direction of Lyman, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Shendrikholove. With full control over the settlement, the Russians have now consolidated their positions near Serechne, Shendrikholove, and the northern flank of Derilove, which means they can now expand their offensive operations towards Derilove, Dobryshevo, Stavki, and Novoselivka to cut the supply line of the Ukrainian forces to the northwest of Lyman by cutting off the road going through Dobryshevo in the central and southern parts of the settlement, and also to strengthen the offensive operations towards Lyman itself. The fighting in Serechne has reached a stalemate between the Russian and Ukrainian forces with no developments since the 10th of September, 11 days ago, which indicates that the Russians doubled down on their fighting in the Serbiansky Forest area, while the Ukrainians are stabilizing the situation by launching consistent counterattacks and manning the positions and fortifications within the near vicinity of the settlement to support the defense of Lyman. However, the Russians are continuously advancing on the western flank to the northwest of Lyman, cutting off the supply lines, limiting the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area, which will slowly lead to the Russian capture of Lyman with the consistent advances to the east, northeast, north, and northwest of the city. At the same time, Zelensky himself claimed that he has now finished building a new offensive force that is ready to fight in the coming weeks. This means that the Ukrainian forces have created another group similar to the ones that launched the Kursk incursion, and that they are ready to launch a new operation. This will likely be, if his words are true, in the eastern section of the front line, as the border sections are now much more powerful than they used to be. The borders are entirely manned. Any Ukrainian attempts at probing Russian positions have shown strong Russian border positions that have managed to hold back any incursions or pushes. The Russians are also expanding their cross-border activities, which means that the Ukrainians are unlikely to launch an offensive operation into Russian territory again. It is more likely that they will double down on counterattack operations in the east to prevent a Russian capture of the Donetsk region. One of the reasons for this is that during the negotiations between Putin and Zelensky and Trump, Putin wanted control over the 4 annexed regions, to which Trump presented a compromise where they accept the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, but have to give up their positions in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. To which Zelensky himself said, even if they get back everything else, if they lose Donetsk, then he might as well give up all of Ukraine. So based on that, Zelensky will likely dedicate whatever forces he has left for offensive operations to counterattacks within the Donetsk region, whether that is in the Bakhmut direction to regain control over the canal, to push into Toretsk, or to counterattack in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, whether it is in the western or eastern or northern flank of the city. The Ukrainians have many possibilities that will strengthen their defensive capabilities in this area in exchange for offensive forces. However, Deep State Map has also complained about the use of air assault brigades, which are assault brigades for defensive operations, which is not really what they have been training for, which also indicates again that the Ukrainians are using their offensive capabilities for defensive operations, which is putting every shape through the square hole. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.